I knew something was off the second I saw tire tracks in the dirt behind my shed. That little sliver of land about 20 feet wide and 60 feet deep was technically mine. It sat on the edge of the neighborhood where my property met the HOA's common area, mostly used for walking paths and gossip. I didn't care much about it until the HOA decided to care way too much. I'm Quentin Barrow. I'm a 44-year-old guy who works from home, keeps to himself, and likes my space. That land, it mattered now. I was dragging my trash cans back when I noticed the new gate. A tall black aluminum security gate bolted into concrete footers right across the only vehicle access to my back lot, and it was locked with a keypad. "What the hell?" I muttered, walking down the side of my property to get a better look. That's when I saw her. Eleanor Nichols. HOA board president, local pain in the neck, and queen of unsolicited lawn critiques. She was standing in front of the gate like she'd just unveiled a statue in her own honor. "Oh, Quentin, good you're here," she said, turning and flashing that fake politician smile. "We went ahead and installed the new security gate. It'll help limit vehicle access to the walking path. Safety first, on my land," I asked, walking up to the gate. "This is literally on my property." She waved her hand like I was being dramatic. "Oh, it's barely a few feet." "You weren't using it anyway. The board approved it last month. You can't just build something on someone else's land because you think they're not using it," I said. "That's not how property works." Eleanor pulled out her clipboard like it was a magic wand. "Well, according to the original neighborhood plans, this strip was marked as potential green space. So we considered it part of the development." "Considered isn't the same as own," I snapped. "And I've got the survey documents to prove this land is mine." She sniffed the air like I'd just offended her ancestors. "Well, if you're going to be unreasonable about it, I'll have to bring it up at the next board meeting." "You do that," I said. "And in the meantime, I suggest you don't lock people out of their own property." I walked away before I said something I'd regret, already planning my next move. 2 days later, I had my own lock installed right over theirs. Big rust-proof master lock, my land, my lock. 3 hours after that, Eleanor was back, red-faced and sweaty, standing on the other side of the gate with 2 other HOA board members panting behind her. "You locked the gate," she barked, shaking the bars like a zoo animal. "I did," I said, sipping a cold soda and leaning on the fence post. "On my land that you trespassed on without permission." "But we need access to the path," one of the men wheezed. "You have access," I said, pointing at the winding trail that ran along the other side. "It's a half-mile longer, I timed it. You're being petty," Eleanor cried. "No, I'm being legal," I said. "Next time you want to build something, try asking." They held a board meeting 3 nights later. I sat in the back row, all quiet-like. Eleanor tried to spin the story like I was endangering the neighborhood. "But Quentin's land is part of our community's original design," she said, waving a highlighted printout nobody could actually read. "No, it's not," I interrupted, standing up. "Here's the official survey map from the county, certified and time-stamped. You'll see the gate is 5 feet onto my property." There were murmurs. "And here," I continued, holding up a folder, "are the cease and desist letters I'm mailing to the HOA and your contractor. If you don't remove that gate in the next 14 days, I'll file a civil suit." The room went silent except for someone coughing in the back. Eleanor's face looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "This is outrageous." "What's outrageous," I said, "is that you thought you could take my land and I just let it slide." I walked out before she could respond, hearing one of the other homeowners whisper, "He's got a point." And that was just the beginning. By the time Saturday rolled around, the gate still stood there, locked twice over, once by them and once by me. Eleanor hadn't so much as made eye contact since the meeting, which suited me just fine. But I knew better than to think she'd give up that easily. I started noticing a few things. First, the landscapers who usually trimmed the walking path every Thursday didn't show. The area behind my shed grew more overgrown by the day. Then, A few neighbors mentioned being told certain homes weren't in compliance with vague landscaping regulations. One of them was mine. I checked my mailbox the next morning and found a citation envelope thick, official-looking, and printed with the HOA's letterhead. Inside was a warning notice stating that my failure to maintain community-facing green space violated a clause in the covenant. A fine of $175 would be imposed if I didn't remedy the neglect within 5 days. The kicker. The photos attached were of the narrow strip behind the gate, the same land they'd forcibly claimed a week ago. I didn't even bother calling a liener. I took the envelope, drove straight to the county clerk's office, and asked to speak with a zoning compliance officer. I spent the next hour with a guy named Henry Klein, who looked like he'd been dealing with bureaucratic nonsense since the Cold War. After I showed him the photos, the survey map, and the gate location, he leaned back in his chair and said, "They're fining you for not maintaining land they tried to appropriate." I nodded. "And they installed a structure without a permit. Sure looks that way." He typed something into his computer, then printed out a document and handed it to me. "This is a formal complaint form. Fill it out, attach your evidence, and I'll initiate a code enforcement investigation. In the meantime, do not pay that fine." I submitted the complaint, then stopped by the local records office on the way home. After paying a small fee, I got a copy of the HOA's original development agreement and land use plan. Sure enough, the strip was not listed as common area or easement. It had been part of my parcel since the neighborhood was platted. I wasn't just annoyed anymore, I was digging in. Later that evening, I caught my neighbor, Dan, returning from a walk. He was a retired firefighter who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. "You hear about the gate?" I asked, walking up to the sidewalk. Dan laughed. "Heard about it. I tripped over it last week trying to shortcut back home. Who puts a gate on someone else's land?" "They do, apparently," I said. "They're trying to pretend it's community property." Dan frowned. "That's not how it was drawn up. I remember when they paved that trail. The developer left that strip out because it couldn't be zoned for public use, something about runoff drainage. That was news to me. Any chance you'd be willing to write that down?" I asked. "Absolutely," he said. "And I've got the original HOA handbook from when this place was built. I'll dig it up." The next morning, I set up a motion-activated trail cam on a post behind my shed, angled toward the gate. Not for security, though that was part of it, but to document how often HOA members or their contractors came onto my land. If they were going to accuse me of neglecting it, I wanted a record of their trespassing. 3 days later, the footage showed a man in an HOA-branded vest using bolt cutters to remove my lock. He didn't even hesitate. Just walked right up, clipped it, and swung the gate open. That was enough. I called the sheriff's office. When the deputy arrived, I explained what happened, showed him the footage, the documents, and the complaint I'd filed with code enforcement. He watched the video twice, then asked, "Did you give them written permission to install anything on your property?" "Not once." He nodded and radioed it in. 10 minutes later, he was knocking on a liener's front door. I stood across the street, arms folded as she opened it. "You're being ridiculous," she shouted after he introduced himself. "We've always maintained that section. It's part of the community." The deputy didn't flinch. "That doesn't override property boundaries, and cutting someone's lock without permission is criminal mischief. You'll need to come down to the station and answer a few questions." There were at least 3 people watering their lawns nearby, all of whom suddenly had nothing better to do than watch. Eliner's husband came out, flustered, trying to argue, but the deputy calmly repeated that she wasn't being arrested, just brought in for questioning regarding unauthorized property access and destruction of private property. She went pale when she saw me. I didn't wave. I just watched. That night, I posted stills from the trail cam footage to the neighborhood forum, no caption, just the image of the bolt cutters mid-swing, time-stamped and clear. The comments came in faster than I could read them, some shocked, others furious. A few residents defended the HOA, but they were quickly drowned out by people asking why the board was breaking into private land. By the end of the thread, someone had started a petition to call a special meeting to vote on board leadership. I stayed quiet. Let the fire build on its own. 3 days later, I received a letter from the County Code Enforcement Office. The gate had been constructed without a permit, the HOA was in violation, and they had 15 days to remove it or face daily penalties. A separate investigation into misuse of HOA funds was being initiated based on the construction invoice I'd submitted, one that showed the board had paid a contractor nearly $8,000 for an access control system, without itemizing materials or location. The real kicker came when I got a call from Henry at zoning. "Just a heads up," he said. "We pulled the HOA's recent filings and found something interesting. They tried to amend the community map last year, quietly moved your lot boundary on a draft, and filed it with the county. It didn't go through because it wasn't signed by you, but it's clear they tried to retroactively claim that land as theirs. That wasn't just shady. That was criminal. I forwarded everything to a real estate attorney I'd worked with years ago when buying the house. She took one look at the documents and said, 'Oh, they're in trouble.' We filed a formal complaint with the State HOA Oversight Commission and submitted evidence of attempted boundary fraud. My lawyer also filed for an injunction to prevent any further modification of the land until the legal dispute was resolved. The same day the injunction was served, someone left a note on my door. No envelope. Just a lined sheet of paper with 4 words scrawled in black marker. 'You'll regret this.' I handed it to the sheriff's deputy when he came by for a follow-up. He took a photo, bagged it, and said, 'We'll run prints for good measure.' I wasn't worried. I had cameras, I had legal support. And now I had the neighborhood on my side. Leaner missed the next board meeting. So did 2 other members. In their place sat 3 volunteers who looked like they'd just walked into a burning building. The room was packed. Someone motioned to begin a recall vote. Every hand went up but one. 3 days after the recall vote, I was standing on my back porch with a cup of black coffee, watching a city-marked truck pull up next to the gate. 2 men in reflective vests got out, rolled down a measuring wheel, and started pacing the perimeter with practiced precision. One of them paused, jotted something on a clipboard, then glanced up and gave me a nod. They didn't need to ask anything. The injunction paperwork taped to the inside of the shed window had already made it clear. No modifications, no access, no exceptions. The gate was now legally considered an unauthorized structure, and the HOA was under direct review. I was ready to move on. But then the audit results came in. A knock came at my front door just after lunch. It was Deputy Ruiz again, this time with a plainclothes investigator beside him, a woman in her early 40s with a badge clipped to her blazer. "Mr. Barrow," she said as I stepped outside, "I'm Investigator Lorna Evans with the State Department of Regulatory Affairs. We're following up on your submission regarding the unauthorized changes to recorded land boundaries." I stepped aside and offered them both a seat at the patio table. Ruiz stayed standing, arms crossed, while Evans opened a folder and slid a few printed documents across the table. "These are internal communications from the HOA's board email account. We obtained them through a subpoena issued late last week," she said. "You'll want to read this one." It was an email from a leaner to the HOA's treasurer, time-stamped just 2 months before the gate was installed. The subject line simply read, "Back lot." The body was short, but damning. If we move the boundary line on the revision map and file it quietly, we can claim that strip as community utility space. Quentin doesn't seem like the type to notice. By the time he catches on, we'll have precedent on our side. I stared at the paper, then looked up. She really thought she could fake a boundary and just take it? Evans gave a tight nod. What's worse is this wasn't the only instance. We've found similar attempts involving 2 other properties in the neighborhood, both smaller, but with similarly ambiguous back edges. "And the other homeowners?" I asked. They didn't catch it. One of them's been paying landscaping fees on land they no longer legally own. Ruiz's voice was low and even. We're treating this as coordinated fraud. There's a paper trail showing they used HOA funds to hire a private surveyor willing to revise documents off record. I leaned back, stunned. That's not just shady, that's criminal. Evans didn't blink. Yes, which is why we'll be issuing formal charges against Mrs. Nichols and 2 other board members by the end of the week: falsification of public records, misuse of community funds, and property boundary manipulation. You going to arrest them? I asked. There's a warrant being drafted now, she said. In the meantime, we need you to continue documenting any further contact, and don't respond directly to any board communications. Forward them to us. I agreed, then gave her the trail cam footage. I hadn't yet uploaded the one from 2 nights ago. It showed a man with a hood pulled low approaching the gate with a crowbar, only to turn and retreat when the floodlight kicked on. Evans watched it silently, then said, "We'll run facial recognition." Could be someone reacting to the investigation. That night, I received a certified letter from the acting HOA board. It was brief, apologetic, and included a formal statement announcing the suspension of all pending fines and enforcement actions related to the disputed property. It also stated that all current board members were cooperating with state authorities and would be resigning at the conclusion of the investigation. But I wasn't done. I attended the emergency HOA meeting held in the local library auditorium. Over 60 residents showed up, more than the board had ever seen. The interim president, a soft-spoken man named Carl Witten, stood at the front with trembling hands as he read a prepared statement. We acknowledge that members of the previous board acted in direct violation of state property laws and HOA governance procedures. Effective immediately, all actions taken under the fraudulent amendments are nullified. We will be holding new elections within 30 days. He looked up. We also encourage any homeowners who believe they were affected to come forward. I raised my hand. I'd like to speak. Carl nodded and stepped aside. I walked to the front, took a breath, and said, "This isn't about a gate anymore. It's about what happens when people in charge think they are untouchable." A few heads nodded. Others leaned forward. They didn't just try to take my land. They tried to rewrite the map to make it look like I never owned it in the first place. And if they'd gotten away with it, they would have kept going. In the back row, I spotted Dan, arms folded, giving me a slow nod. I held up the printout of Aliner's email. "This is what they thought of us. He won't notice." That's what she wrote. That's what they counted on, that we'd all stay quiet. I dropped the paper into the box labeled Evidence for Review and stepped back. The room erupted into applause. The following week, I met with a land use attorney, not for a lawsuit, but to file a protective easement across the back lot. It would formally restrict access without written permission and ensure that no future board could attempt the same trick. My property line was now secured by law and paper, not just fences and cameras. That Thursday, Aliner was arrested outside her home. The news spread fast. Someone posted a blurry photo of her being led to the cruiser, face downcast, wrists bound. The charges were worse than anyone expected. Not just fraud, but conspiracy to commit land theft, falsification of government filings, and misappropriation of community funds exceeding $25,000. The HOA's insurance provider dropped them the next morning. I received an email from Investigator Evans that afternoon. The county is moving to dissolve the current HOA charter pending a community vote. If passed, the HOA will be dismantled entirely, and a city oversight committee will take temporary control of all shared spaces. At the next meeting, the vote was unanimous. By the end of the month, the gate was gone. Not just unlocked or removed, gone. The concrete footers were jackhammered out, the keypad system stripped, the path regraded to its original layout. In its place, I planted a row of cypress hedges, tall and dense. On my side, I added a small wooden sign that read, Private property, no trespassing, no drama, no confrontation. Just a quiet, permanent reminder. A month later, I got a letter from a woman named Beth Rivera, the new head of the city's temporary oversight panel. She thanked me for my documentation and persistence, and included a check for $2,000 reimbursement from the state's HOA Fraud Recovery Fund. I used it to buy two things: a new riding mower and a lockable steel mailbox that no one could tamper with. The neighborhood changed after that. More people showed up at meetings. The walking path got repaved under city management, and the new committee published every decision online with open comment periods and clear voting windows, and I went back to my quiet life. No more gate. No more fake fines. Just me, my land, and the knowledge that sometimes when you stand your ground, the whole system shakes loose around it. It was late autumn by the time the last of the concrete dust settled. The weather had cooled, the air crisp with the scent of pine mulch and distant chimney smoke. I had just finished reseeding the patch of earth where the gate once stood, replacing the scarred ground with a few rows of native grass and river stones. It was quiet, peaceful. But I never stopped watching. Word got around that a leaner had taken a plea deal, avoiding trial by agreeing to testify against the private surveyor and the former treasurer. I hadn't expected her to talk, but apparently when the felony counts started to stack, so did her willingness to cooperate. That wasn't the end of it. Detective Mason, who had since taken over the investigation from zoning, reached out one afternoon. He didn't call. He showed up in person, knocking twice and waiting with the same calm patience I'd come to associate with people who didn't need to rush to make their point. "There's something you ought to see," he said, holding up a manila folder, thick with printed spreadsheets and scanned receipts. I led him to the kitchen, motioned to the table. He laid the folder open and turned it toward me. "These are internal expense reports from your HOA's operational account. They were flagged during the state audit for inconsistencies. About $60,000 can't be accounted for. Most of it withdrawn in small amounts, just under reporting thresholds." I flipped through the sheets. "Who signed off on those?" He tapped the column marked authorized by. "Mostly the treasurer. But the bigger concern are these here." He pointed to a string of entries labeled security infrastructure and consulting services billed to an entity called Blackridge Solutions. "They're not a landscaping company," he said. "They're a shell corporation registered in Nevada. No actual employees. No office, just a P.O. box." "Let me guess," I said. "Someone local set it up." "We traced the registration to a burner account opened with a fake name," he said. "But the IP used to file it came from a residential address just 4 blocks from here." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He flipped to the next page and slid it across the table. It was a still image from a traffic camera. A man in a Navy HOA windbreaker, exiting the side door of the treasurer's house at 2 in the morning, holding a box of documents. 2 nights before the audit team arrived, Mason said. "We found the box in a dumpster behind a storage facility, shredded but not thoroughly." He pulled out a photo of one of the recovered documents. It was a reimbursement slip for a cash withdrawal tagged land acquisition initiative. They were trying to buy off a retired county clerk to backdate a boundary adjustment form, Mason said. "He didn't take the money, but he didn't report it either. Said he didn't want to start trouble." I leaned back, rubbing my jaw. "So what happens now?" "They're going federal. When you start falsifying property records and laundering HOA funds through fake vendors, it stops being a local issue." He stood, collecting the folder. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is building a conspiracy case. You won't need to testify unless you want to, but they'll probably reach out." I walked him out and watched his car disappear down the street. The neighborhood felt smaller that evening, not in a bad way, just exposed. Like someone had peeled back the topsoil and reminded us all what was underneath. That weekend, the city hosted a town hall at the community center. Not a formal meeting, just a chance for folks to ask questions about what came next. I went, partly out of curiosity, partly because Dan had roped me into helping with setup. The turnout surprised me, not just in size but tone. No anger, no finger-pointing. People were tired, sure, but they were also ready to rebuild. A woman named Trina, who ran a local after-school tutoring program, stood up and suggested converting part of the old HOA office into a shared workspace. Another man offered to run neighborhood watches on a volunteer basis, now that the security budget had been exposed for what it really was. I kept quiet until the end, but when the moderator asked if anyone had final remarks, I took the mic. I used to think HOAs were just a necessary evil paperwork and paint colors and a bunch of meetings. I didn't think they could steal land, or forge maps, or try to erase ownership with a pen and a wink. But they did, and we caught them because we stopped assuming they were just doing their jobs. A few heads nodded, nobody clapped, it wasn't that kind of speech, but afterwards several people came up to thank me. One gave me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from a neighbor I barely knew, thanking me for bringing truth into daylight. A week later, the indictments were unsealed. The treasurer, the surveyor, and the former vice president were charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and falsification of public records. Aliner's plea agreement was included in the filing, complete with a signed statement detailing how they'd planned to rewrite property boundaries in phases, starting with mine as a test case. The city council voted to dissolve the HOA's corporate charter permanently. All its remaining assets, bank accounts, office equipment, even the signs were liquidated and placed into a community trust managed by a new nonprofit oversight group. They called it the Evergreen Neighborhood Cooperative. No dues, no fines, just volunteers and transparency. I was invited to join the advisory board. I declined. Politics wasn't for me. But I did offer to help with legal filings and property documentation, and they took me up on it. A month after everything wrapped, I stood where the gate used to be, sipping a cup of coffee as a neighborhood kid rode past on a bike, tires crunching the new gravel. The hedges were taller now, full and green, hiding the view of the walking path. Not out of spite, just privacy. The way it always should have been, Dan joined me a few minutes later, hands in his jacket pockets. "Hard to believe it got this far," he said, looking out at the trail. "All that nonsense over 20 feet of dirt." "It was never about the dirt," I said. "It was about control," he nodded. "Well, they lost it." I looked at the sign planted in the ground. It was simple, just a carved wooden plaque that read, "This land is privately owned. Respect begins here." And for once, it felt like everyone finally understood what that meant.